Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how do skilled performers selectively respond to some of the many available affordances in their environment? How do they coordinate their action to keep multiple affordances available? How can this ability be developed in practice? A look at skilled intentionality. So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and/or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. Before diving into today's topic, I wanted to mention a few things going on in and around the podcast. First, in case you missed it, in December, I created a series of videos reviewing 10 of my favorite papers from 2020. For this, I tried to frame them within the ecological approach and concepts I talk about regularly on the podcast. If you're interested, you can find those on my YouTube channel. Second, on January 20th, I'm going to be hosting the first in a series of journal clubs discussing Tim Ingold's great book, The Perception of the Environment, Essays on Livelihood, Dwelling, and Skill. I would love to have you read along with us if you're interested. On today's episode, I want to revisit the topic of how a performer decides which action to perform, or in other words, how they set their goal or intention for the execution of an action. As I've discussed in a few previous episodes, the traditional view of how this is achieved is through mental representation and information processing. An athlete picks up information from their environment, for example, the spacing of opponents, combines it with previous experience in their mental model, makes some predictions about what will happen, and then makes an explicit decision. I'm going to pass or fake or drive. That leads to the execution of an action. The alternative to this, of course, is that the athlete directly picks up affordances or opportunities for action in their environment such that their decision emerges from the ongoing perception-action cycle. But there's a limitation to this basic affordance view. As Bill Warren nicely discussed in our interview back in episode 330, there's not just one affordance available at any one time, there are multiple affordances with different values. Furthermore, affordances can be nested within our broader goals. For example, acting on an affordance to deceive an opponent is nested within the broader goal of trying to score. How does a performer choose which of these affordances to act upon? Is it possible for them to act so as to keep multiple affordances available at a given time? Is this a large part of what being skillful actually really is? To address these questions, I want to look at the Skilled Intentionality Framework developed by Eric Reichfeld and colleagues. Not only does this framework help to better understand ideas related to decision-making and intention in performance, but it is also going to set the stage for the discussion of some other really interesting issues I'm going to tackle in future episodes. For example, how we can understand the use of imagery in sports from an ecological, non-representational view. Imagine you're an ice hockey player carrying the puck up the ice and you have a 2-on-1. So in other words, you have a teammate with you, but you're approaching one defender. Obviously, the primary opportunity this situation affords is scoring a goal. But within that, there are multiple nested and related affordances. Driving by the defender, passing to your teammate, trying to deceive the defender, shooting the puck yourself, etc. From the visual information provided by the gaps between yourself, the defender, and the goal, you perceive that the affordance of shooting is the most available, so you wind up for a slap shot. This creates new information for the defensive player, inviting the affordance of blocking your shot. As they move towards you, you alter your stick movement online so as to pass to your teammate who shoots and scores. In this situation, you've demonstrated skilled intentionality. defined by Reitfeld and colleagues as the selective engagement and skillful responsiveness to multiple nested affordance simultaneously. In executing a 2-on-1 like this, a skillful performer will engage with multiple affordances at the same time. That is, they will regulate their distance between themselves and the other players so as to keep multiple affordances available, and they will alter their intention as to which affordance to attempt to realize based on the unfolding online currently available information. A lesser skilled performer might commit to one affordance, like shooting, very early, and or get too close to their teammate, reducing the opportunity to pass without the puck being intercepted. Being skillful does not just involve perceiving an available affordance and acting to achieve it. That's skilled perceptual motor control. It also involves skilled intentionality. So let's look at the Skilled Intentionality Framework in more detail to understand how this is achieved. Again, the problem we're trying to understand here is how, in a particular context, skilled performers are selectively responsive to only some of the many available affordances or possibilities for action offered by their environment. To start off with, let's look at how affordances are understood. In their framework, Reitfeld and colleagues take a relational view of affordances. That is, the perception of affordances depends on our abilities to achieve them or our action capabilities. A hockey player that is a slow skater will not perceive the affordance of driving past a defender with the puck. Affordances do not exist independently of the capabilities or effectivities of the perceiver. This is different from what is called the dispositional view of affordances, which I'm not going to go into here. In their paper, they use one of my all-time favorite pieces of writing from James Gibson. Quote, "An affordance is neither an objective property nor a subjective property, or it is both if you like. An affordance cuts across the dichotomy of subjective-objective and helps us to understand its inadequacy. It is equally a fact of the environment and a fact of behavior. It is both physical and psychological, yet neither. An affordance points both ways, to the environment and to the observer." End quote. Another important point they make that I'm going to discuss more in future episodes is that affordances do not just tell us about opportunities for action here and now in the present. They also have a past and a future. In any situation, the opportunities for action are shaped by our social cultural conventions, as a society at large and within the context of the environment a particular coach creates. For example, a more offensive-minded coach creates an environment where space affords a defensive player jumping in to support an attack on another team's goal, while another more defensive-oriented coach may not. To use a term from ecological psychology, affordances exist within a form of life, where this is defined as a certain kind of practice or coordinated pattern of behavior between multiple individuals. For example, about a year ago, if I asked to have a Zoom meeting instead of meeting in person, many of my colleagues would have looked at me like I'm from Mars. Our form of life as a group, the opportunities different situations invite, has changed. The future aspect of affordances comes from the fact that acting on nested affordances is essentially a form of anticipation. To quote the authors, "The concept of skilled intentionality as multiple simultaneous states of action readiness for engagement with affordances entails orientation towards and preparation for possibilities for future action, which is a situated form of anticipation." End quote. The puck carrier in my example is regulating space so as to make affordances available in the future, not to achieve the end goal now. Reitfeld and colleagues call this ability maintaining optimal grip on multiple affordances simultaneously. Another point the authors make is that the landscape of affordances is dynamic and is changed by our actions. When I wind up to shoot, I change the affordances available to the defender, which will likely cause them to close down the space between them and me, which changes my affordances, and so on. Of course, a key aspect of an affordance we need to understand in this framework is relevance. To put this issue in the author's words, quote, "The immense variety of affordances available in the landscape of affordances of a form of life raises the question how, in a given situation, an individual can be selectively open to this landscape. How and why is an individual selectively responsible to only the relevant affordances out of all these available possibilities for action? And how do affordances solicit a particular course of action in a given situation?" End quote. For this, the authors take a very different view from the traditional idea that relevance comes from goals set by an executive controller. Quote, "Within the Skilled Intentionality Framework, We're careful not to presuppose goals, tasks, or aims of some mysterious origin as a source of relevance, but instead see the emergence of the soliciting character of affordances as the result of a process of self-organization. And quote, the relevance of affordances relates to a disequilibrium within a self-organizing individual environment system. Skilled intentionality means reducing disequilibrium by moving towards an optimal grip on multiple relevant affordances simultaneously, that is, on the field of relevant affordances. Skilled intentionality is understood as expressing a process of self-organization of multiple affordance-related states of action readiness. End quote. This disequilibrium they're talking about is essentially a function of us being goal-directed creatures. A phrase used in the paper that beautifully expresses this is, as living beings, we have a fundamental lack of indifference to our environment. We are always looking for opportunities, and therefore are motivated to organize within the abundant invitations for action we get from the environment. And with skill, we learn to maintain what the authors call an optimal grip on these opportunities. This idea of optimal grip can be related to the concept of metastability in a dynamical system, which I discussed back in episode 310. Metastability is a state in which multiple solutions are held in a state of weak attractiveness, as Kelso calls it. So unlike attractors in a multi-stable system, these are easy to get in and out of. In that episode, I also discussed a paper by Herstovsky and colleagues that is used here as an example of skilled intentionality. Specifically, in that study, it was shown that skilled boxers maintain a distance from their opponent, which allows them to respond to multiple affordances: jabs, hooks, uppercut punches, and defense. So here again is the essential idea. Skilled intentionality is not performing an action to directly achieve one's goal. It is acting to keep multiple affordances for achieving your goal available and being able to rapidly switch between them, or being metastable, if you will. This ability is, of course, directly shaped by the individual task and environmental constraints. A boxer with longer arms or faster punches will have a different metastable regions than another boxer. And this will, of course, change as the constraints change, for example, due to fatigue. These ideas can also be conceptualized using the term action readiness. Quote, for action control, it is important that multiple states of action readiness can self-organize into a macro level of pattern of preparation for action. It is this characteristic of states of action readiness that allows the skilled intentionality framework to avoid presupposing goals of mysterious origin and make self-organization central instead. End quote. Finally, an important point the authors emphasize is that due to the dynamic nature of the affordances, we can't design a solution to achieve our goal ahead of time. Quote, the right design, therefore, does not need to be determined in advance. There is no fully specified picture or description of the end result on the basis of which the design is realized. On the contrary, the design is realized in practice because it's getting increasingly determined or developed in acting within the landscape of affordances. End quote. We have a trajectory through a landscape of affordances, and their availability is going to decrease with time, leading to a solution that's going to emerge. For example, as the puck carrier in my example gets closer and closer to the net, the opportunities for passing, for example, will become less and less. What are the implications of this skilled intentionality framework for coaching? Well, as I mentioned, it's critical to recognize that the landscape of relevant affordances for an athlete will depend on the social, cultural environment of their form of life. A new learner acquires their skill within an existing form of life created by society at large and within the specific practice environment created by a coach. Affordances are not solely determined by material properties in the environment. There is what is so-called social material entanglement. That is, quote, affordances are not just situated in the materiality of the immediate behavioral setting, but entwined within a more culturally encompassing, socially shared, and historically developed constellation of practices and form of life. End quote. The practice environment makes certain affordances relevant and inviting and others not. As a coach, are you inviting a broad range of affordances or creating an environment where you restrict many of them? It is also critical that we take into account the idea of having an optimal grip on multiple nested affordances simultaneously. We often try to separate and isolate these. For example, in team sports, we often think of training offense and defense separately, whereas in reality, these things exist together. For example, if one of the players in my 2-on-1 example is a defenseman, One of the affordances they have to keep a grip on while trying to score is getting back to their position to defend. Developing athletes with this skilled intentionality requires creating rich practice activities where multiple nested affordances are available rather than isolating them. There is information an athlete uses to keep within a multi-stable region that they will never learn to pick up if you're always training them in isolated situations with only one opportunity for action. Think scoring activities instead of shooting or passing ones. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.